Catcalling was the word Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez used for 8 years whenever Ben Shapiro's challenge came close enough to demand a real answer, a convenient label designed to turn scrutiny into harassment and accountability into an offense. For 8 years, she treated the invitation as beneath her, framing the request as the entitled behavior of a man who believed he deserved her time, while carefully avoiding the more obvious question of whether the public deserved her answers. Tonight, however, there was no social media post to hide behind, no friendly interviewer available to redirect the conversation, and no committee clock she could consume with a speech until the question disappeared. She was sitting across from Ben Shapiro, facing the format she had avoided since 2018, and within the first 90 seconds, millions of viewers began to understand why she had worked so hard to avoid it. The problem was never that Shapiro was unusually cruel, unusually loud, or unusually intimidating. The problem was that he asked questions with answers, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had built an entire political brand around never being trapped inside one. Yes led to another question, no led to another question, and every attempt to escape through a prepared paragraph only exposed the space where a direct answer should have been. That was the danger, because AOC was not facing an opponent who needed applause, emotional momentum, or permission from the room before continuing. Shapiro's method was mechanical, almost brutally simple. Identify the claim, isolate the fact, demand the number, and refuse to pretend that a speech was an answer. The chain moved forward without caring whether the audience liked him, whether the moderator approved of his tone, or whether AOC's supporters erupted when she delivered one of her familiar applause lines. Question after question, the chain led toward the place she had spent 8 years avoiding, and when she finally arrived there, the room discovered that confidence and command were not the same thing. The stage itself was almost insultingly plain, with 2 chairs, 2 microphones, and nearly a decade of political avoidance compressed into the distance between them. CNN had presented the event as a broad discussion about the future of progressive politics, language soft enough to let AOC's team accept without publicly admitting that she was finally participating in the debate she had repeatedly rejected. Her preparation had been extensive, because no serious political operation walks into a Shapiro confrontation without studying his rapid-fire sequences, his transitions, and his habit of using every answer as the foundation for the next question. Her advisors had reportedly built the strategy around one central instruction: never accept the binary frame, never give him the clean yes or no, and never allow the exchange to become a cross-examination. Expand every answer, control the clock, redirect toward moral language, and transform specific questions into broad conversations where emotion could outrun arithmetic. The strategy sounded impressive in preparation because most political strategies sound impressive before someone begins asking for numbers. It survived for only a few minutes because it depended on Shapiro cooperating with the performance, acknowledging the reframing, and allowing her to substitute a speech for the requested fact. AOC opened exactly as expected, with the standing energy, practiced cadence, and moral certainty of a politician who had spent years turning committee hearings into campaign clips. She spoke about inequality, housing, working families, and the people in her district who deserved more, directing her attention toward the camera because the camera had always been her strongest ally. The audience was not merely watching her. In her political method, the audience was part of the weapon, and that weapon had protected her from countless weak interviewers, hesitant opponents, and formats designed to reward theatrical certainty. Then she addressed what she called the elephant in the room, returning immediately to the 2018 invitation and the $10,000 offer Shapiro had made for a debate. She repeated her defense of calling the request catcalling, arguing that when a man demands a woman's time and feels entitled to her response, the description remains appropriate. It was a line built for applause, already polished by years of repetition, culturally loaded enough to move the discussion away from her refusal and toward his supposed misconduct. The gallery responded exactly as intended, rewarding the frame before anyone examined whether it made sense to compare a public debate request directed at a member of Congress with harassment on the street. For 8 years, that move had ended the conversation because critics became nervous, interviewers changed subjects, and supporters treated the accusation itself as proof. Shapiro did not become defensive because defensiveness would have validated the diversion and allowed AOC to control the opening exchange. He answered that she was correct about one narrow point. He was not entitled to her time, but the 720,000 constituents whose taxes funded her congressional salary were entitled to answers about her public record. That distinction cut through the performance immediately because this was not a private citizen demanding personal access to a woman who owed him nothing. This was a political figure paid $174,000 a year, seeking re-election, raising millions of dollars, promoting major national policies, and asking the public to accept her judgment on matters involving trillions of dollars. Shapiro's response stripped away the protective language and returned the discussion to its actual subject. This was not catcalling, this was Congress, and in Congress, questions are supposed to have answers. He moved to the first question without offering her time to rebuild the emotional frame, asking how much the Green New Deal would cost. AOC responded with the rehearsed explanation that the proposal was a framework for investment rather than a conventional line item budget, insisting that asking for a total cost was the wrong question. Shapiro did not debate the explanation, praise its sophistication, or pretend that redefining the proposal answered the original inquiry. He asked again, using the same words, because the question requested a number and she had provided a paragraph. That refusal to reward evasion immediately changed the rhythm, exposing how dependent modern political communication had become on interviewers accepting language that sounded substantial while containing nothing measurable. Shapiro then introduced the estimate of $93 trillion over 10 years, attributed in the script to the American Action Forum, and placed it beside the absence of a cost estimate, funding mechanism, or implementation timeline in the resolution itself. His argument was not complicated, which made it more damaging. Anyone proposing a project of historic financial magnitude should know what it costs, how it will be financed, and how it will be executed. In a private company, a proposal demanding enormous resources without a budget would be rejected before the presentation ended. Yet in Congress, the same absence of planning could be disguised by moral language and converted into online enthusiasm. The sarcasm worked because it rested on an ordinary professional standard that millions of people recognized from their own jobs, businesses, and household budgets. AOC had introduced one of the most famous policy packages in modern American politics, but when asked for the price, she attempted to argue that the price itself was an inappropriate subject. Shapiro moved forward before she could replace the number with another explanation, turning to her 2019 statement that the world would end in 12 years if climate change was not addressed. 7 years had passed, he noted, so the logic of her own declaration left only 5 years before the advertised deadline arrived. AOC described the statement as a rhetorical device, an answer that may have softened the literal meaning but created a larger problem around the certainty with which the original claim had been delivered. If the statement was rhetorical rather than factual, then she had used apocalyptic language to promote one of the most expensive proposals ever attached to a congressional resolution. The issue was no longer merely whether the prediction was exaggerated. The issue was whether fear had been used as a fundraising and political instrument, while the person deploying it understood that the deadline was not literal. Shapiro tied the climate statement to campaign communications, arguing that donors had been asked to contribute under the pressure of a deadline presented as an existential emergency. He used the phrase material misrepresentation, not as a casual insult, but as legal language intended to place the political argument inside a compliance frame. The temperature in the room shifted because accusations of hypocrisy are familiar, but references to federal standards, donor communications, and potentially misleading solicitations carry a different kind of weight. AOC had prepared for ideological disagreement, moral confrontation, and aggressive questioning, but the exchange was becoming an examination of whether her public claims matched the records surrounding her campaign. Then Shapiro moved to the next figure, asking how many of the 42 bills she had introduced during 7 years in Congress had actually become law. The answer was 0, and the silence before it arrived was more damaging than any insult Shapiro could have delivered because the number required no interpretation, no ideological framing, and no sympathetic moderator to explain it away. 7 years in Congress, 42 introduced bills, roughly $1.2 million in congressional salary, and not one of those measures had become law, which reduced the record from a revolutionary image to a brutally ordinary question of output. Shapiro's point was not that every member of Congress controls the entire legislative process, because no serious observer believes that, but that AOC had repeatedly used the introduction of doomed bills as evidence of achievement while raising money from supporters who were encouraged to treat symbolic activity as legislative success. The distinction between governing and marketing suddenly became unavoidable, because a bill that never becomes law may still generate headlines, fundraising emails, viral clips, merchandise sales, and the appearance of combat without producing a single enforceable result. In that light, the 0 was not merely a statistic, it was a summary of how efficiently political theater could be converted into influence, while the actual work used to justify that influence remained unfinished. Shapiro then turned to one of AOC's most repeated ideological declarations, her claim that capitalism was irredeemable, and asked whether she still stood behind it. She tried to soften the statement by referring to the present structure of the system, but he returned to the binary form because the original claim had not been delivered with soft edges, footnotes, or exceptions. Either capitalism was irredeemable or it was not, and every attempt to create a third answer exposed the distance between the slogan used in public and the caution used when accountability arrived. A direct yes would place her against the economic system used every day by workers, contractors, family businesses, and millions of constituents who were not hedge fund managers, but people exchanging labor, products, and services for money. A direct no would admit that years of speeches, fundraising appeals, and viral declarations had relied on language she was unwilling to defend when a simple question removed the protective fog. Shapiro treated her hesitation as confirmation and immediately connected the ideology to the financial machinery of her own campaign. Her operation had raised more than $15 million through Act Blue, a private technology platform functioning inside the same market system she described as morally beyond repair. Her campaign store sold political merchandise at premium prices, including clothing branded with anti-capitalist slogans, proving that even the rejection of capitalism could be packaged, priced, marketed, and delivered through capitalist transactions. There was nothing accidental about the contradiction, because the campaign did not merely exist within a market economy. It mastered the market logic of emotional demand, personal branding, recurring donations, and product sales. The woman condemning the system had become exceptionally skilled at using that system to transform outrage into cash, attention into merchandise, and ideological purity into a professional political enterprise. The contradiction became sharper when Shapiro moved from fundraising income to campaign spending, because the language sent to small donors was now standing beside the financial records describing where portions of their money had gone. Supporters were asked to contribute $10, $25, or whatever they could afford because they were told they were financing a struggle against inequality, entrenched wealth, and a corrupt economic order. The filings cited in the script showed substantial spending on private air travel and expensive hotels, creating a picture far removed from the modest revolutionary image projected through social media and campaign appeals. Shapiro's accusation was not simply that luxury spending looked hypocritical, because hypocrisy alone is so common in politics that voters have almost been trained to expect it. His argument was that the solicitation and the use of funds appeared to tell different stories, and when donors are persuaded by one story while the expenditure report documents another, the discrepancy stops being merely embarrassing. To make the contradiction impossible to dismiss as an abstract dispute between national personalities, Shapiro introduced Danny Molina, an auto repair shop owner from East Elmhurst in AOC's own district. Danny earned his living repairing vehicles, charging customers for his labor, paying expenses, managing revenue, and using what remained to support his family, which made him a capitalist in the most ordinary and unglamorous meaning of the word. He was not manipulating global markets, buying political access, or hiding assets through complex entities. He was fixing cars, tracking costs, paying taxes, and trying to keep a small shop alive. AOC's sweeping language branded the system behind Danny's work as irredeemable, while her campaign collected millions through that same system and spent portions of it in ways Danny could never justify on his own financial records. The comparison was devastating because Danny represented the people political rhetoric claims to defend, yet the rhetoric itself treated the economic mechanism supporting his family as something morally contaminated. Danny also represented a standard of accountability that Congress frequently avoids because a small business owner cannot answer questions about revenue, payroll, rent, parts, or taxes with an emotional speech and expect the government to applaud. Every dollar must be documented, discrepancies must be explained, and deadlines remain deadlines even when the business owner has a compelling personal story. Shapiro's challenge was therefore simple. Could AOC say that every line of her campaign's financial record was as clear, consistent, and defensible as the records demanded from people like Danny? The question did not accuse her of a crime by itself, but it stripped away the special moral immunity politicians often claim when their stated principles collide with their own spending behavior. A mechanic in Queens could be audited over a small inconsistency, while a national political figure could raise millions on ideological promises and rely on applause to prevent anyone from following the money too closely. The next chain moved to crime. And this was where the debate became more dangerous because Shapiro connected AOC's public activism directly to conditions inside the district she was elected to represent. He asked about her June 2020 message supporting the demand to defund the police, and she immediately tried to translate the slogan into a broader policy discussion about redirecting resources toward community-based services. Shapiro refused the translation because the original post had not said reform, rebalance, or strengthen alternatives. It had used the word defund, a word chosen precisely because of its confrontational clarity. The question was whether she still stood behind what she had posted, not whether she could now construct a more politically survivable explanation years later. Once again, a slogan designed for maximum viral force became strangely complicated when she was asked to accept its plain meaning under direct examination. AOC rose from her chair and shifted into the style that had protected her throughout her career, using physical energy, moral urgency, and a broader discussion of public safety to expand the room around a narrow question. Standing allowed her to perform strength, to transform the exchange from an interrogation into a speech, and to invite the audience to react to her conviction rather than inspect the missing answer. She insisted that her position had always centered on community safety, and that the language of defunding belonged to a larger movement for reimagining how public security should function. The explanation was familiar and emotionally polished, but it could not erase the wording of the original post or the political purpose served by that wording at the moment it was published. Shapiro waited for the speech to finish and then asked whether she knew that crime in her district had increased by 70% since 2019. She did not answer, and the absence exposed something more serious than disagreement over policing because it suggested that the representative who had publicly advocated a radical shift in law enforcement policy did not know the most important crime figure affecting her own constituents. A member of Congress may dispute the causes of rising crime, criticize the methods used to measure it, or argue that additional social investments are necessary, but first that member must know the number. AOC had spent years speaking with certainty about the systems responsible for public insecurity, yet when asked about the reported change in the district she represented, the certainty disappeared. The problem was not that she lacked a perfect solution to every crime category. The problem was that she had promoted a national slogan while apparently failing to carry the local data needed to defend it. The silence made Shapiro's entire case more powerful because it showed the gap between possessing a platform and possessing command of the facts. Shapiro cited the FBI crime figures referenced in the script and then placed them beside a February 2025 constituent newsletter in which AOC's office had described the community as safer because of the investments she championed. The conflict was direct. The newsletter told residents and donors that conditions had improved, while the crime data presented on stage showed a sharp movement in the opposite direction. This was no longer an argument about whether a slogan sounded radical, whether capitalism was morally flawed, or whether the Green New Deal was visionary enough to justify incomplete budgeting. It was a conflict between a factual claim in an official communication and a measurable condition inside the district, the kind of conflict that cannot be repaired through volume, applause, or another speech about good intentions. When Shapiro connected the newsletter, the crime statistic, and the rules governing donor-facing communications, the room stopped waiting for AOC's next clapback and started recognizing that the questions were building a record. The room went quiet, not because the audience had suddenly become sympathetic to Shapiro, but because the connection he had drawn was too direct to dissolve with another polished answer. AOC's newsletter said the community was safer. The data cited on stage said crime had risen sharply, and the contradiction now sat in front of millions of viewers without the protection of a campaign edit. Shapiro had taken a tweet, an official communication, a district statistic, and a federal compliance standard, then placed them in a single line that even a hostile audience could follow. There was no complicated ideological theory to debate, no abstract policy model to hide inside, and no opportunity to accuse him of misunderstanding her broader vision. The question was whether the message sent to constituents matched the conditions those constituents were living through, and the answer looked increasingly uncomfortable. AOC responded with the force that had carried her through years of hostile hearings, cable news attacks, and partisan ambushes, raising her voice and broadening the argument until the room once again felt like a rally. She demanded to know where Shapiro's health care plan was, where his housing legislation was, and what authority a podcaster had to judge the work of an elected representative. She reminded the audience that he had never won an election, never written a law, and never knocked on doors in the communities she represented. The attack was emotionally effective because it shifted attention away from the factual gaps and toward the apparent arrogance of an unelected commentator challenging a sitting member of Congress. Her supporters erupted, and for a brief moment, the volume of the applause seemed capable of burying every unanswered question beneath it. Shapiro waited only long enough for the room to settle, then used her own attack to reinforce the distinction she was trying to escape. He agreed that he had never written a law because he was not a member of Congress, but she was, and after 7 years, none of her 42 introduced bills had become law. He agreed that he was a podcaster, but the podcaster had just provided the crime figure from her own district while the elected representative had not known it. He rejected the claim that yes or no questions reduced her work, arguing instead that they tested whether the record matched the promises used to defend that work. Did the bills pass? Did she know the numbers? And did the newsletter accurately describe the district conditions? Were not insults. They were the minimum questions any taxpayer should be allowed to ask. The comparison with Danny Molina returned because Shapiro understood that ordinary competence was more damaging to political theater than another partisan accusation. Danny knew the cost of a brake job, the price of a timing belt, the monthly rent on his shop, and the exact revenue needed to keep the doors open. He did not have a communications team to transform missed targets into moral victories, and he could not respond to an audit by accusing the accountant of asking questions in bad faith. AOC controlled a congressional office, a national campaign operation, and millions of dollars in fundraising, yet she could not provide the cost of her signature proposal or the crime rate in the district she represented. If Danny failed to document his finances, he faced penalties, while the congresswoman could misstate conditions, receive applause, and immediately ask voters for another term. When the moderator called for closing statements, Shapiro did not attempt to repeat every contradiction because the audience had already watched them accumulate in real time. He returned to the word AOC had used for 8 years and argued that the debate had finally explained why she preferred to call the invitation catcalling. The reason was not personal fear, misogyny, or intimidation, but the danger of a format where a large social media following could not answer a factual question. In a yes or no exchange, applause could not change the cost of a policy, a viral slogan could not change the number of enacted laws, and emotional authenticity could not rewrite a federal filing. The format was merciless, only because it required the person making the claim to stand beside the record created by that claim. Shapiro then moved beyond ideology and focused on the documents that had followed AOC onto the stage. Her newsletter described a safer community, the crime data cited during the debate described a substantial increase, and her campaign communications had repeated a climate deadline she later characterized as rhetorical. The spending records referenced private air travel, while her public image emphasized commercial travel, and the fundraising language condemned capitalism while the campaign used capitalist platforms, products, and transactions to build its war chest. Each contradiction could be dismissed separately as politics, exaggeration, or imperfect messaging, but together they formed a pattern that was harder to treat as accidental. Shapiro emphasized that he lacked subpoena power, investigative jurisdiction, and institutional authority, but millions of viewers had now seen the discrepancies presented side by side. AOC's final statement lasted longer than the allotted time because brevity had become the most dangerous condition in the room. She spoke about the Bronx, her mother, working families, the courage required to stand when powerful people demanded silence, and the political necessity of refusing to be reduced by hostile framing. It was the kind of speech that had built her national profile, filled campaign events, and convinced supporters that emotional urgency was evidence of moral seriousness. Under different circumstances, it would have been received as another example of her ability to seize a room and turn confrontation into inspiration. After 90 minutes of unanswered numbers and contradicted records, however, the speech sounded less like a rebuttal and more like another beautiful paragraph offered where a fact had been requested. She received the standing ovation her supporters had been waiting to give, but the applause could not alter the documents already displayed before the audience. A standing ovation and a federal record are not the same thing, because one measures loyalty in a room while the other preserves dates, amounts, statements, and expenditures after the room empties. The emotional victory belonged to AOC's section of the audience, but the evidentiary victory belonged to the person who had forced the claims and records onto the same screen. That distinction mattered because applause fades quickly, while recorded contradictions can be clipped, replayed, submitted, cited, and examined by people who were never present. By the time the event ended, Shapiro had built no official case, but he had created the raw material from which official scrutiny could begin. 2 clips spread faster than all the others, and they traveled through different audiences because they exposed different weaknesses. The first showed Shapiro asking for the cost of the Green New Deal, AOC failing to provide a number, and the $93 trillion estimate appearing in the vacuum left by her answer. That clip crossed party lines because it did not require viewers to agree about climate policy. It required only the ordinary belief that a person proposing a massive project should know its projected cost. Professionals, small business owners, managers, and workers recognized the moment immediately because they had all seen plans collapse when ambition arrived without arithmetic. A local Bronx community board member summarized the reaction with 4 words: she did not know. The second clip paired the safer community language from AOC's newsletter with the crime increase cited during the debate, and it spread through a far more specialized network. Campaign compliance professionals, election law commentators, federal filing analysts, and watchdog accounts examined the clip not as entertainment, but as a potential discrepancy in donor-facing communication. The language they used was clinical rather than partisan, focusing on whether the factual claim in the newsletter matched the data available to the office that issued it. Once the phrase material factual discrepancy became attached to the clip, the debate stopped being only a political spectacle and began to resemble a document trail. Millions of views guaranteed attention, but the attention of people who understood compliance procedures created the possibility that the televised contradictions would not remain confined to television. During the first week after the debate, the National Legal and Policy Center filed the supplemental complaint described in the script, attaching the televised statements to records that already existed. The organization had previously challenged campaign payments totaling $1,825 that were categorized as leadership training, and the new submission widened the focus without abandoning the original issue. It cited the contrast between the commercial flight image and the reported private air travel expenditures, the Safer Community newsletter, and the crime figures presented during the debate, and the anti-capitalist fundraising language beside the campaign's own spending patterns. The complaint was narrow enough to avoid looking like a partisan manifesto because it relied on dates, clips, categories, and statements that could be reviewed without accepting Shapiro's political conclusions. AOC had supplied the most damaging material herself by repeating the claims on camera, voluntarily, clearly, and before an audience too large to dismiss as a private misunderstanding. The Federal Election Commission also received approximately 2,300 individual complaints during that same week, a volume the script characterized as unprecedented for one member within a single filing period. Many of those complaints were likely emotional, repetitive, incomplete, or unsupported because mass political attention always produces submissions that do not survive professional review. The importance was not that every citizen complaint carried legal weight, but that thousands of people had focused institutional attention on the same group of contradictions at the same moment. An agency can dismiss noise, but concentrated volume creates a procedural problem because the decision to ignore it becomes visible, measurable, and vulnerable to criticism. Shapiro possessed no authority to compel action, yet his questions had created the pressure that makes inaction harder for institutions to explain. By the second week, the existing complaint involving the $18,725 in payments categorized as leadership training appeared more significant because the debate had supplied what the script described as a broader pattern. One disputed category could be explained as poor wording, an accounting decision, or a technical classification that looked suspicious only when separated from its context. Several disputed descriptions pointing in the same direction create a different impression, especially when each one appears to make an uncomfortable reality, sound cleaner, cheaper, safer, or more politically convenient. Psychiatric services described as leadership training, private travel paired with a commercial flight image, and rising crime beside a message of increased safety were presented as variations of the same fundamental problem. The records did not merely raise isolated questions anymore. They invited reviewers to ask whether strategic labeling had become a routine method of protecting the political brand. The House Office of Congressional Conduct then received the referral described in the narrative, requesting a preliminary review of AOC's communications with constituents and donors. The referral focused on the Safer Community newsletter and asked whether its description of district conditions had been misleading when compared with the crime data cited during the debate. It was not a formal finding, criminal charge, or final conclusion, and the script did not need to pretend otherwise for the development to matter. A referral creates a file creates a sequence of reviewable steps, and each step forces staff members to decide whether the discrepancy deserves another question. Political rhetoric thrives in spaces where nobody is required to open the folder, but once the folder exists, slogans must begin competing with documents. The third week moved the story away from institutions and back toward Danny Molina, whose ordinary command of his own business became a sharper criticism than any professional commentator could manufacture. A local Queens cable station interviewed him inside the repair shop with grease on his hands and the equipment of his trade visible behind him. Danny said he knew the cost of every service, the rent on the property, and the numbers required to keep his operation functioning, while his representative could not state the cost of her own signature proposal. He also rejected the idea that his work should be treated as irredeemable simply because it depended on customers, prices, labor, risk, and profit. The clip spread because Danny sounded neither partisan nor rehearsed. He sounded like a working constituent who had finally compared the standards imposed on him with the standards accepted from Congress. His statement that he had voted for AOC in 2020 made the criticism more dangerous because it denied her defenders the easiest available dismissal. He was not presented as a lifelong conservative, a Shapiro activist, or an outsider searching for a brief appearance on cable television. He was a constituent who had once trusted her, watched the debate, recognized the missing numbers, and concluded that the gap between image and competence had become too large to ignore. His frustration was professional before it was ideological, rooted in the simple reality that a person responsible for money must know where the money comes from and where it goes. That message crossed party lines because basic accountability is not owned by either party, regardless of how aggressively politicians attempt to turn it into a partisan weapon. Soon afterward, 47 small business owners from New York signed the joint letter described in the script, including operators of repair shops, bodegas, restaurants, nail salons, and laundromats. Their message avoided the elaborate vocabulary of campaign law and relied instead on the language of people who complete forms, preserve receipts, and expect penalties when their numbers fail to match. They argued that small businesses could be questioned over discrepancies of a few $100s, while a campaign raising more than $15 million appeared protected by political celebrity. They asked for a public accounting of the expenditures and for the same standard to be applied upward that was routinely applied downward to them. The letter had no independent power to compel an investigation, but it carried the moral force of constituents demanding that their representative live under the rules used to discipline them. Those 47 signatures transformed the issue because they gave federal reviewers something political organizations alone could not provide: visible permission from within the district to examine the records seriously. Watchdog groups are easily described as ideological, media clips are easily dismissed as entertainment, and Shapiro himself could always be attacked as a conservative provocateur seeking a viral confrontation. Local business owners were more difficult to wave away when they spoke about tax forms, audits, payroll, and the ordinary fear of making a mistake that might trigger government scrutiny. Their request was not for special punishment, but for equal treatment, which is precisely the kind of demand that exposes how much special protection political status can quietly purchase. AOC had built her brand on speaking for workers and small businesses, yet some of those same people were now asking why her campaign appeared entitled to standards they would never receive. For 8 years, she had called the debate invitation catcalling, a label meant to make the questioner look illegitimate before the question could ever be heard. Once the debate finally happened, the questions turned out to be ordinary demands for costs, outcomes, crime figures, expenditure explanations, and consistency between campaign language and public records. She could dominate a camera, command applause, and deliver speeches with the confidence of someone who understood exactly how political emotion travels through a modern audience. What she could not consistently do was provide the short, factual answer that allowed the next piece of evidence to be tested against the first. The very format she had portrayed as harassment revealed itself as accountability stripped of the protective decoration surrounding her public image. That was why the debate did not end when the moderator closed the program, because the program had produced clips, the clips had produced complaints, and the complaints had produced files. A newsletter saying safer remained beside data, saying worse. Fundraising language remained beside expenditure records, and slogans about legislation remained beside a 7-year total of 0 enacted bills. None of those contrasts alone proved every allegation made by Shapiro, but together they created the pattern the script had been driving toward from the first sentence. The original question was still waiting beneath every speech, ovation, accusation, and attempt to widen the conversation beyond the facts placed on the table. It had always been a yes or a no, and after 8 years of running from that format, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez still did not have the answer.